Hello, can you hear me? If you can hear me, please type one. Okay, good. Okay, good evening, everyone. Can you also see me? Okay, good. So let me record this class. This is class number 6, right? Okay, good. Let me record that. So I'm going to say Dr. Sama, and this is class number 6, and we are on our way. The class is being recorded as usual. So it's a very good evening to everyone. So we're doing the sign of 4. This is our second class in the sign of 4. Of course, you cannot compare the sign of 4 to the other novel, Wuthering Heights, right? In terms of ideas, in terms of complexity, right? Look at the characters and see how superficially drawn they are in the sign of 4, right? Look at how complex the characters in in Wuthering Heights were, right? Did you notice that? Okay. So have you seen how light-hearted the sign of 4 is if you, of course, compare it to Wuthering Heights? No complexities of any sort, unless you give some thought to the relationships that we heard about between the British administrators in India and the Indians. And of course, you still remember what happened during the mutiny and how the mutiny was portrayed in the popular imagination of the English back there. Remember, we quoted some material from the time, and they would all confirm the prevailing sentiment that the Indians are wrong, that the Indians are violent and savage and all these kinds of things. Uh, aside from that, it's not very, I mean, the novel is not very deep. And that would explain, I'm sorry, excuse me, and that would explain perhaps the reasons why it had such an appeal among people of the time, because people at the time, I mean, when you finish work, you wouldn't engage in very heavy-handed stuff. I mean, you need something that is light-hearted, that is not bothering, something that can perhaps stimulate your mind, but not to the extent of engaging you in deep issues like the issues of the empire and stuff like that. So it does touch on these issues, but in a very light-hearted way, if you like. Make no mistake about it, Doyle is not Emily Bronte. He is less talented. He is less. You wouldn't compare to her in so many ways. He is less poetic. Look at the language of Wuthering Heights. Look at how the characters are portrayed. Look at the development of the characters. We don't have that. And this is perhaps something that we shouldn't blame Doyle for. Remember, the genre itself is made in such a way so that you would ignore the development of the characters and you would focus on the plot. And this is what we see in the Sign of Four. Okay, so I would like you, before I kind of proceed with the rest of the effort, I would like you to share some impressions. I mean, now perhaps you have read the novel, most of it or all of it, because it's again, it's not a 3 volume novel like we have seen in Wuthering Heights. So it would be a nice read over perhaps 2 to 3 days maximum. So if you have read it, just give me 5. Give me 5 if you have read the whole novel. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, Nabila is halfway through, which is fine and okay. Dima read it, and Fahd and Al Ustaz, and pretty much everybody else. Okay, that's good. That's good. Okay. Okay, that's okay, Arsh. We appreciate the fact that you guys have started. We appreciate the fact that most of you have finished it. So you're now in a position to talk about the novel, those who have read it. So what you have to say about the novel, you may want to perhaps compare it to Wuthering Heights. Um, I don't know what you're talking about, yeah, Ustaz. We're talking about something. We're talking about the novel in general, and you're giving me examples that I didn't ask for. Okay, طيب. Who would like to come to the mic and share stuff stuff with us about the novel? I mean, who is ready to come to the mic in the first place? No one? I don't know why. I mean, yani all of a sudden you guys have inhibitions about going to the mic, which never existed when we first met. Um, so Kamar is saying it was a nice light book to enjoy. I didn't need to look up many words because of the simple language compared to Wuthering Heights. That's a good reading. This is a good conclusion that Kamar came up with. Fahd agrees with Kamar. Nice light book according to Kamar. She didn't have to look so many words up in the dictionary, and this points to the simplicity of the style and the language. Arch is saying it is interesting and it makes me want to keep reading because of its many mysteries. That's interesting too. Okay. Nabila wants to say something, that's why I'm not commenting until perhaps she comes up with something. It's Nabila and Kamar. Okay. So let's talk. Yeah, Kamar, the plot is simply interesting, and that's rare. Okay, to have it's rare to have a simple plot that is interesting, according to Kamar. Okay. So Kamar wants to say something. Let's listen to what she has to say. Kamar, go ahead.
Good evening.
Good evening.
It was actually my first time reading detective books, as in the British. Usually, as I told you before, I read Edgar Allan Poe. So
Mm.
I had no idea what I was going through, what I was gonna experience. And I thought it's gonna be like difficult because it's British. It's gonna be Old English. It's gonna have different vocabulary, like Wuthering Height. But no, it actually took me 2 hours, and I didn't need much looking for vocabulary. I didn't need to look for the characters. For example, in Wuthering Heights, some chapters I had to read them like more than once to understand what's going on.
I mean,
But with
excuse
this
me,
one,
Kamal. Sorry to cut you off. Can we stop typing and listen to what Kamal has to say? Just stop typing and then focus on what she's saying, okay? And then we can always
uh,
type. Okay, go ahead. Go on.
for Wuthering Height, for example, some chapters I had to read it more than once because of how complex the plot is and the characters themselves. Like I had to focus on each character more than once, so I had to reread the chapters. But in here, the characters are developed in a nice, simple way, in a way that you read the chapter one or the page once and you're done with it and you can move on. You don't have to go back. But with Wuthering Heights, because there are so many characters and the characters themselves are so complex, you end up going through the chapter more than once in case you missed something. But in here, no, it's clean, it's simple, it's clear, and the plot itself, it's simple yet complex in a way that it unfolds, but it unfolds nicely.
Mm, interesting. Okay.
US,
Which
USC,
is,
like for
like I said, Kamara, this is typical of detective fiction in general. I mean, the idea of not having to, I mean, the characters are not deep. Okay, that would give way to the to focus perhaps on the plot. But
yes, yes, short
this is
stories.
meant by writers of this kind of novels. Yani to give them some, I don't want to do kind of injustice to them by saying that they don't know how to, to delineate and portray characters. No, they focus more on the plot, right?
Yes,
Ah,
and
mm,
Dr. Sameh, the
yes.
plot is simple, but you have to unfold it. For example, when you first read the first three chapters, you assume it's a kidnapping case, kidnaps.
Mm,
But then it goes on and then it turns into murder and then treasure hunting. So
mm.
it's simple, but it unfolds into many complex, tiny plots in a way.
Yeah, and it would also, kind of take you to issues that you, under normal circumstances, you wouldn't have thought that this is going to happen in a light-hearted kind of novel like this. When we have seen the entanglements with India and the cause of India and what happened in the mutiny, right? So
Yes.
okay, so it's not, the plot is not as simple as we may think. I mean, the more we read, the more the complications, I believe.
Yes, and for Wuthering Height, for us to understand the plot, it takes a bit of time to understand the plot, to understand the
Mm.
relationship between the characters. But in here, the relationships are pretty clear. Holmes and his assistant, Dr. Winston, and then we have Mary. So the relationships are clear. But like in Wuthering Heights, sometimes it gets confusing, especially because they all have the same names in a way.
Yes.
You sometimes it's like Kathy first or Kathy second. So yeah.
Yeah, it's part of the Emily Bronte scheme, if you like. I mean, she
Titles.
this was one of her
Yeah, we saw.
ways of, of furthering the action of the play. The fact that you have double in everything, double in the characters, in the
Mm.
houses, and in the names of the character, the different generations that we have, and the fact that there is a great deal of you know stagnant action. Whatever happened in one generation happened in a different generation. Yeah, it's complicated, like you're saying, yeah, Kamar. Okay.
And there's a
Yes.
twist when
Okay.
they
Yeah.
when
Go
they
ahead.
get the treasure and they find it empty. That's unexpected.
Hmm. Which is typical again of detective novels and thrillers, right? Okay. Otherwise, we wouldn't call it, we wouldn't have those cliffhanging situations that I was talking about last time. It has to end at one point on a cliffhanging situation so that the following week you're all excited, you want to go and buy the issue from يعني the newspaper issue or the magazine issue. Okay, thank you, Kamar, very much for those insightful observations and remarks about the novel. Let me
You're welcome.
see. Thank you so much. Nabila is saying the difference between them is that in Wuthering Heights, the actual story did not begin from the beginning. However, in the Sign of Four, the story started right away from the second or the third page. That's correct, and that's a very intelligent observation. Thank you, Nabila, for the this nice insight. And that would account for the complexity of Wuthering Heights. You need to kind of read and dig deep into the novel so that you can kind of restage and restructure things in order for it to make sense to you. So it's efforts that you're making while reading Wuthering Heights. You don't have the same amount of efforts. I mean, the novel in The Sign of Four unfolds easily if you compare it to Wuthering Heights, of course. Again, what is interesting about The Sign of Four is that it also uh, um, from takes some of the elements of the short stories. And with short stories, you have brevity, the idea that you don't have unnecessary details and unnecessary uh, uh, events. You can have details, and some of them are irrelevant in order to add perhaps realism or an atmosphere of realism to the novel, but not as detailed as we have seen in Wuthering Heights, right? Because in Wuthering Heights, the details are focused on outside nature and the description of nature, and this is something Emily Bronte was so excellent at. She wouldn't miss the chance to exercise this kind of habit of hers, the idea of describing outside nature, the idea of showing and demonstrating her poetic talents. Um, okay, so let's go. I need to finish The Sign of Four. I had a plan, I remember, and I shared with you the plan last time and said we intend to finish The Sign of Four and move to the beach of Felicia today. We'll finish The Sign of Four today. I think we're not behind schedule. We're doing a good job as far as timing is concerned. I wouldn't be in a rush and start something new today. I'm going to continue with The Sign of Four, and next time, inshallah, on Monday, we can always start and finish The Beach of Felicia because it's not long either, and it's not also complicated, but we can finish it in one class. Okay. So The Sign of Four, everyone. So The Sign of Four is by Arthur Conan Doyle, and of course we said we spoke long and enough about Doyle, and we said that he is Scottish, from Scotland, which is obviously part of Britain. He is British and he is Scottish. And together with being a writer, he was also a physician or a medical doctor. But at one point, yeah, can't you see them? You mean now or forever? Ah, yes, of course, I can. Yes, yes, I can. Yes, yes, you know. Okay. So again, I was talking about Arthur Conan Doyle, and I said that he was a versatile writer, versatile and prolific, which means that he has written so many things. He wrote history, he wrote historical novels, detective novels, um, lots of things. He was again very creative and very talented. But of course, he is known for his detective fiction and detective novels because some of the characters that he created could stand the test of time, like they say. I mean, it means that um, they cut across ages, and we still remember them in the 21st century. Like Holmes, like Watson, like Challenger. These are characters that are very popular even today. And if you mention them, of course, you mention their creator, Arthur Conan Doyle. Again, he was prolific. He wrote fantasy and science fiction stories, plays, romances, fiction and non-fiction, historical novels. Again, what we said about the Sign of Four, we said that it's a mystery novel, detective and mystery. Mystery means that there is a mystery of a sort, and the mystery would be the unresolved case, uh, um, whether it's a murder or a big theft, or perhaps both. This is normally the mystery that the whole story revolves around. And if you have a mystery, you would need a mystery solver, if you like, somebody who would unlock this kind of mystery, and in our case would be Holmes, Sherlock Holmes. What is interesting about the novel also would be the fact that it was published in a magazine, and if it's published in a magazine, you can't have it all in one issue of the magazine. It has to be divided into small bits and pieces, and every week you will have a bit or a piece. And this used to happen, and this was the trend, and this was the style at the time. Again, why wouldn't we have it published in one go as one book? Again, that would be perhaps not um, you know tuning in for the reading public and their needs. What is it that they wanted? They wanted small chunks that they can understand and digest. And this wouldn't happen if you have a long novel. They want something that they can go by every week, something that they can read easily, um, and then they wait for the next week to see a new episode. And that would also explain the the episodic structure of the novel, the fact that you don't feel this coherence that you normally feel in traditional novels. You don't have much coherence because again the focus would be on creating those cliffhanging situations at the end of every and each episode. So this episodic structure would compromise the coherence of the novel sometimes. Again, it was published in 1890, and 1890 means that we're Victorian age, and if we're Victorian age, all the associations of the Victorian age have to come readily to mind. So what are the associations of the Victorian age. When I say the Victorian age, what comes to your mind? Okay, so mass literacy, like Sarah is saying, people are all literate. Nabila is saying, yeah, people were literate. That's correct. Okay, Nabila and Sarah. And also remember the prevailing concepts, the idea of home, the idea of abroad, right? Yeah, urban life, like Noor is saying. Um, I mean, of course, it was the age of Queen Victoria, um, and people would kind of copy what Queen Victoria used to do. If she reads, they read, right? If she is interested in the empire and she has people living with her from the empire, they would welcome that, they would talk about that. This was the time of the Industrial Revolution, like Noor is saying. Yes, that's true. Okay, so what did the Industrial Revolution bring? It brought good things like machines and everything, but it also brought along bad stuff, like the idea of laying people off. I mean, making people unemployed because the machine would, one machine would do the work of 100 people. So what happens if you all of a sudden find yourself out of work and you have perhaps children to feed and perhaps bills to pay? So you would sometimes you would resort to crime, and you would turn criminal. And if you have poverty and crime, so it means that I mean people in the Victorian age wouldn't feel secure or safe. Okay, so what would be the alternative? The alternative would be home. So home is the place where they can feel secure and at home. Outside, outside would be a high level of crime. Outside would be poverty, and outside would be um, people from the empire, from other parts of the world. Um, okay, and they would also pose some kind of threat to the conventional Victorians who believe in conformity in everything. They believe uh, um, in everything white, in everything Christian. So for them to see Indians walking down the street, Chinese walking down, they would feel threatened. They wouldn't feel okay. So what would be the resort? The resort would be home. Yeah, this is yeah. Kamar is saying yes. This is the confusion that we have. So you go home uh, in the hope that home would be giving you the relaxation and the comfort and the safety and the security that you want, only to find that home can also be a source of, you know, discomfort. Look at what used to happen in Wuthering Heights. Actually, all the evil stuff happened within the confines of the two houses, and here also home here in this novel is where crime takes place, right? You don't normally commit a crime in broad daylight and in the open. You normally commit crimes in private so that nobody can see you. Uh, yes. uh, yeah, Kamar is saying, ironically enough, that uh, what's his name, Captain Marston. Captain Marston didn't die, for example, in India, where violence is. He was killed, if he was killed at all, because I mean he was suffering from weak health, and it took the other guy, what, perhaps speaking, screaming at him, right, to die. The idea is that he didn't die abroad with the all the strange and the evil associations of abroad, according to the Victorians. He died at home, right? Um, Again, whether this is irony or whether this is the usual confusion between whatever is home and whatever is abroad, this is one of the issues that the book is dealing with. Okay, so again, if I say 1890, so I'm talking about the Victorian Age and all the values and the conventions of the Victorian Age. I'm talking about the idea of home and the clash that it has with the idea of abroad. And also, if I talk about 1890, I'm talking about those kinds of novels that are not as heavy-handed, are not as complex. We're talking about the rise of a fictional trend that we now call crime literature, whether we're talking about crime novels, whether detective novels or thrillers. So when you look at them all, you're going to find them not as deep, of course. You're going to also find the characters are, for the most, they are not the Dickens kind of characters, where you have most of them are poor and uneducated, and we have a great deal of talk about the slums of London, London's underworld. We don't have that. With detective novels, the focus would be on the idea of mystery, and mystery happens, in most of the cases you have middle class milieus and middle class settings. We spoke about the novel as a detective, as part of the detective genre traditions, and we spoke about the elements of a detective novel. Can you share the elements if you still remember them? Again, you may rely on your observations reading the novel, or what we said about those elements and characteristics last time. Go ahead. Mm. We're talking about the elements or the characteristics of detective novels, yeah, Nabila. Okay. So we all agree that detective novels, or the detective novel, is a modern genre. It's something that we haven't seen in the perhaps in the 18th century. It's a new invention, and those kinds of novels again would be suitable and fit for the age, where people wanted to be reassured that crimes are contained and are under control, and criminals get arrested eventually. So perhaps this was part of the message that writers were communicating to the reading public. So we may have a crime, we may have a mystery, but please rest um, assured that everything is under control, because eventually we solve the murder case, we get to know who the culprit is, and he or she gets arrested and they go to jail. So the detective novel is a modern genre, and it has both the elements of the novel and the short story. Okay, so um, it is very clear that it takes more from the short story than from the novel. The idea of brevity, the idea of focus, perhaps we don't have uh, unnecessary details. You can have details that would serve the case, but the details um, are for the most part uh, essential for the solving of the case. Um, Again, it's a development of the Victorian age. It's a byproduct of the age, more or less, because of the reading taste that people developed, being literate for the most part. They wanted uh, something to read, and they also wanted to be, light-hearted, because they their jobs are they work for long hours, and they want something entertaining at the end of the day, something that may perhaps stimulate their intellect, something that can keep them amused and happy. Okay, so you have only one single idea. Normally, you have a criminal case, which is either a murder or a big theft, and sometimes you have both. Spoke about the earliest detective novel, and we said it's the Murders in the Rue Morgue, and this was written by Edgar Allan Poe. Does it mean that we didn't have any other attempts on the continent by other writers in Europe? Of course, we had attempts in neighboring France. Um, Again, the form of the detective novel would be very suitable for magazines and newspapers because of the idea of serialization. The fact that you don't publish the novel um, as a whole, you divide it into small bits and pieces, and you feed the newspapers and magazines with it, with a bit or a piece every week. Um, how did this kind of novel genre came to its own and became recognized, and how or when did it reach its the shape that we now know of it? It would be with Doyle and with the Holmes series of stories. Again, this kind of novels would depend also on the advancement in scientific discovery and science in general, um, they would benefit substantially and a great deal from the advancement in perhaps forensic medicine, in methods of deduction and logic. So they are more or less implementing the tenets of science. So central to the development of the detective fiction is the ability of the detective to amass or gather data from the case for the case, and then he starts to distinguish between what is relevant and what is not. He uses his mind, and he in this sifting process that he is engaged in, and then he starts to eliminate scenarios that are illogical or implausible, that are not possible, and then he draws um, or comes up with conclusions. Again, those kinds of novels um, give you the sense that they are based on evidence, they are evidence based, and they are empirical and factual. These are all the tools of the detective. The detective who happens to be the main character depends on that, on empiricism, depends on deduction, depends on evidence. Again, there would be a great deal of details, significant and insignificant. Who decides on their significance? It would be the central character, who is the detective himself. Again, what would attract people at the time to these novels? It's the short story form that it assumes. See how short and how brief it is. It would be also the illustrations that would accompany the different pages. You normally have illustrations, pictures, um, and of course the personality of the detective himself. This nice combination would be a recipe for appeal. People would find those or these novels very engaging and well worth their time and their money. Again, it can be the novel can be realistic in its details, um, but not in its perhaps delineation of characters. So, unlike the realist novel, detective fiction is driven by the resolution of the plot. So, it's not the plot, um, it's the plot rather than the characters that propels the action forward. There is no focus on the characters. Again, the structure is typical and repetitive, and you have patterns that get repeated in every detective novel. Okay, so again, the detective must be memorable. The detective means the guy who starts the investigation and comes up with resolutions and solutions for what seems to be a puzzle. The fictional detectives are expected to be both clever and a bit of the ordinary. We spoke about um, Holmes, and we said that he is a little bit weird. Suffice it to say that at one point we're going to discover that he is given to he's addicted and he has to inject himself. Again, the focus on Baker Street, which is obviously a landmark in London now, and it has always been. It gives you a hint of realism that you would need as a reader. You need to identify with places and characters, perhaps. So the writer knows how to satisfy his readers by providing, names, English names, by providing names of streets and numbers of houses that they are familiar with, that they can go to and check for themselves. That would add to the atmosphere of reality and realism that the writer is trying to create. Again, detective fiction was written for urban inhabitants who were filled with an anxiety about crime. Yeah, with prosperity, with industrialization, with with the empire opening its arms to other colonies and expanding, more, yeah, expanding, yani beyond the borders of Britain, you would expect to see high levels and high rates of crime. And again, in order to kind of appease the anxiety of the people because of this high rate of crime, you would um, kind of need to have novels like these where there are murder cases, and those murder cases get resolved at the end, so that people would understand that their security and safety are considered, are priorities for everyone, for the government and for the police force. So consuming detective fiction like Holmes stories in bite-sized, small and regular chunks provided readers with a sense of engagement with the threat of crime, while offering them a comforting reassurance that all was indeed well and taken care of. So again, I'm not going to go back to this. We have spoken enough about the history of this kind of novels. What is interesting about these novels is that readers also participate in the deduction method to work their way through the story. So you get so uh, close to the narrative, you get so engaged in the narrative that you yourself assume the role of a detective, and you start looking for evidence in order to come up with a conclusion as whether this or that character is the culprit. So you yourself get to you get to become a detective in your own right. So throughout the chapter that we're reading, the textbook we mean, there is a focus on the relationship between ideas about home and abroad in the novel, and the importance of reading for Victorian people. So we're talking about the relationship between home and abroad, and we're also continuing with the idea of reading in the Victorian Age. Again, one of the basic tenets of the Victorian Age would be creating a safe and morally righteous home. And this was the true expression of the Victorian social values. So for them, the family, as you know, the family home was idealized, from Queen Victoria's own household at Osborne House to the millions of newly built townhouses in London. So home and the idea of home were all in all. And then comes writers who perhaps highlight and stress these values or challenge them, like we have seen in Emily Bronte's novel Wuthering Heights. So The Sign of Four is a domestic novel. Since we're taking on a tour of a number of London interiors as part of the story, especially at the home at 221B Baker Street. This is where Holmes resides, and this is where he's going to think of the murder case, and he's going to try to piece together the different clues and come up with a conclusion as who as what happened and how. Again, you're going to have lots of domestic details. There are obviously lots of details, and most of these details are domestic. Again, this is also meant to give you um, a sense of realism that would also make the character of Holmes believable and lifelike. Again, there is a great deal of clutter. The whole place is cluttered with details. Uh, Again, this is meant to again fill out gaps so that the novel does not appear foreign to you. So the Victorian readers were provided with visual cues to aid the reading of the Sherlock Holmes stories. You would also have illustrations and pictures, and that are also taken from real houses, and so again the reader wouldn't feel kind of strange to what is happening. So the description of 221B Baker Street is cluttered with details of a domestic interior that readers grew to think of as real rather than imaginary. So the address embodies much of the coziness that Victorian readers would have known from their own home. They can always identify with the places. They know they can recognize these places when they see them in the novel. Again, there is attention to significant and insignificant details. You have real places, objects, and times, and the geography of London is referenced or plausibly referenced. Again, it is true that we all agree that it is rooted in London with its familiar places, but there is a measure of abroad to the story. So, though it was written about home, it shows an interest in the Victorian abroad by showing the anxiety about the empire felt at home. Okay. So, what are the signs of the physical signs of home as seen in the novel? You would look for them. You can always recognize them with the rituals of Holmes, the things that he does over and over again. Like what? Dinners and fine drinks, reading the newspaper over breakfast, um, training or practicing the violin, taking afternoon tea. That would be very familiar and very recognizable to lots of the readers at the time. So as you can see, the story as it unfolds with its familiar addresses in Baker Street and elsewhere in the novel would serve as a marker of domestic security, and this domestic security is always set against the unpredictable and sometimes frightening world outside, with its usual scenes. I mean, foreigners walking down the streets of London, high levels of crime, poverty, squalid places in the manner of Dickens' novels. So the threat that the outside world presented to the home is an everlasting theme in the novel. Even whatever we consider home in a positive sense, when we talk about the Baker Street address, where Holmes resides, we're going to find that this is also not all the time in keeping with the characteristics and what we know about home. It has tarnishes and it has things that would tarnish the image and you know, the white image of home. You get to know, for example, that he is a drug addict, and the fact that he's an addict and he has to get injected a number of times every day. So this was as far as the idea of home. If we move to the idea of abroad, we're going to see that abroad is there in the plot because there are so many entanglements with abroad. There is a great deal of engagement with abroad as represented by India. India is there in the novel through most of the characters who either used to work there or they are Indian themselves. So India looms large in the narrative of the Sign of Four, as it did in the imagination of the Victorian readers. And Holmes himself is aware of the importance of India to British life and its relation to crime in the metropolitan center of London. As a detective, he would also ascribe some of the crimes to foreigners, and chief among them would be, of course, Indians, because India at the time was um, on top of the British Empire's possessions. Of all the possessions and colonies, India stood out as the most precious and the most important. So Holmes is aware of the importance of India to British life and its relation to crime in the metropolitan center of London. You would see Indian servants who were conspicuous in the London homes. They also appear in the novel. Whether they were well depicted or badly depicted, this is perhaps the subject of another day. then most of the characters that you mm. um, are you, are you talking about me or talking about Doyle? Because obviously I'm only analyzing. So this idea of clear-cut separation or division of the novel into two parts is more or less artificial. It doesn't exist. You just read the novel as a whole, you analyze the novel as a whole. Again, I was talking about the entanglement with abroad as represented by India, and we spoke about Indian servants being conspicuous in the London of the time. We also spoke about most of the characters have been to India either as some of them were born there and some others were there on missions as administrators in the British Empire, or perhaps as you know, I mean, in different capacities, obviously. So, if London is depicted as the comfortable world of domestic interiors, um, conviviality, emotional order, India is depicted as the polar opposite. It is described or it is perceived because this is a perception and perceptions are for the most part. India is perceived as a land of extremes, extremes uh, in and of wealth and poverty, danger, lawlessness, and financial opportunity. So you have lawlessness and opportunity. You have wealth and poverty. You have danger and lawlessness, and you also have financial opportunity. Lots of contradictions in the mind of the British people at the time. This is, like I said, is a perception, and these perceptions are normally challenged because they are normally based on, I mean, stereotypes and prejudice and bias. So both the wealth and danger of India threaten to destabilize London life, challenge the coziness and the peacefulness of London life, according to the Victorians, of course. Okay, what time is it? Can we take a 5 minute break because I'm getting very hot. I don't know why today. We're taking a 5 minute break, okay? Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Are we all back? Okay. Okay, so before we left, we were about to talk about the background of the novel, I mean, the events that the novel claims to build on. And if you still remember, it was the Indian Mutiny. I'm not going to be too political about it this time around. We already spoke about what we think it was, and we have defended the Indians enough last time. Remember, we said that this was more or less like a reaction. You can't beat me up every day and you expect me to bear and grin, right? I have to, at one point, explode and react in a violent way, and this is actually what happened. So again, the Indian Mutiny is what the novel is based on, and not the mutiny itself. We're talking about the chaos that happened in the aftermath. Remember, the mutiny started, and then people started to take up arms against each other. I mean, the British would claim that they were killed in hundreds and perhaps thousands, and the Indians would simply say that we were kind of reacting to years of servitude, years of injustice. Okay, so this, I mean, I'm trying to say the novel. Let me check. I'm trying to say that what happened was part of the popular imagination of British people at the time. Sorry. Again, I was trying to say that the mutiny and what happened was part of the popular imagination of the time, and it was good material for lots of writers to rely on and to get inspired by, and Doyle happens to be one of those writers. So the entire narrative plot is based on the chaos brought about by the Indian Mutiny of 1857. Um, I'm not going to talk about the mutiny anymore. You already know about it. I'm not going to speak about the reasons for the mutiny. Some of them are direct. Remember when I said that the British administrators were presenting a new kind of gun, and in order to maintain it, you have to use pig and cow fat, and this is would be very offensive to the insensibilities of the Hindus and the Muslims. Again, to say that this is the only reason would be kind of unfair, because there were other perhaps more substantial reasons, like the idea of injustice, the idea of taxes and stuff like that. Yes, like Arsh is saying, there was a lot going on. Again, we spoke about the literary responses, and we have taken an example. By the way, Doyle would be also, although Doyle's novel was written perhaps 10 or perhaps 15 years after the incident, but I would consider it, with the events that we have seen, with the characters that we have read about. I think this is also another literary response to the mutiny. The most important literary response would be Christina Rossetti's poem. We spoke about the poem. I have shown you the poem. in which Christina Rossetti is um, perhaps depicting or portraying only one side of the story. As you have seen in the poem and as you have read, the focus is on white victims and how they are given as a few that are being tortured and killed and are being killed by hundreds and perhaps thousands of Indians. Um, Again, this has to be read in this context, the context that the Victorian Age was, or during the Victorian Age, you have Britain as being the an imperial power that has colonies everywhere. And with imperialism, with imperial expansion, of course, you have riches and you have money and you have economic prosperity. So the economic prosperity that England or Britain was experiencing and witnessing at the time um, is a great deal the the product of I mean being in England, being in India and looting India of its treasures. So you cannot talk all the time about India, and you're talking about it in a negative way, and you're benefiting substantially from its treasures and from its wealth. This is hypocrisy, right? You cannot ascribe all the crimes that you have at home to Indians and other people from the other colonies, and you are benefiting substantially from their wealth and treasures. The novel starting point, and perhaps this is how it ended, would be that there is no. I mean, the relationship is unproblematic. I mean, the novel never touches on that. Never touches on whether the presence of any British people or English people in India was legitimate or not. It never questions or challenges the legitimacy of the British rule in India. This is obviously besides the point, and this perhaps gives you, you know, um, insights into how Doyle looks at the issue. I mean, he is obviously neutral. I mean, he believes in the British Empire, and he doesn't talk about its negative sides, except for very few examples when he talks about what's his name, this Jonathan. Um, we have a number of evil characters in the novel. One of them is Jonathan Small, for example, and how he looks at Indians and how brutal he is himself. So Doyle's politics were uncomplicated. He was a supporter of the empire. I mean, he doesn't talk about it. I mean, he doesn't question it, and not questioning it, and not you know, challenging the abuses and not exposing the abuses that used to take place over there would mean that you accept it in an indirect way. Yeah, what about it? Yeah, this is an example of what used to happen. The idea of yeah, looting and stealing stuff and transferring it to Britain or England. But as you have seen, Kamar and everybody else, I mean, his Doyle is. I mean, his focus is not on the looting of a nation, the looting of the treasures of a nation by another nation. This big idea is not what he is addressing. What he is addressing would be the looting as part of the conspiracy, or as part of the mystery that he is trying to resolve. Okay. Spoke about the structure of the novel, the fact that it is divided into 12 parts, and the fact that each part is given a title that sums up the whole thing, except for the last two chapters. They are bigger. Again, this is in keeping with the tastes of the reading public of the time, and also in keeping with the serialization strategy that they were adopting at the time. You cannot have a whole novel published in a newspaper or in a magazine, so you have to divide it into chunks, and every week people would have a piece. They would read it, enjoy it, and then um, wait for the upcoming one. Again, this was part of what they later termed as the information economy, where people consume reading material like crazy because of the mass literacy of the time that was triggered by acts of parliament that made education possible to almost everyone. Again, the engagement with India is too, too clear to miss. You cannot miss it. It's so conspicuous that you cannot miss. So where can we see that in the novel? You can see that in the names and objects and the people who abound in the text. You have, for example, Mrs. Watson, who was born in India before being sent home to start schooling in Edinburgh. You have Captain Marston. You have the other characters whose affinities and relationship with India cannot be missed in the novel. So in the novel, readers can come across a number of Indian servants and characters. Major Sholto brought 3 Indian servants with him to England when he retired, and after the disappearance of the Agra treasure. Holmes reminds us early in the novel that Watson is an ex-colonial. Ex-colonial means that he used to work as part of the colonial forces, the English colonial forces in India, and that he was part of a war on British Indian borders. Again, as you can see, if London represents on the surface the comfortable world of domestic interiors, India is depicted as its polar opposite. And like we said, it's a land of extremes: wealth and poverty, danger and lawlessness, and uh, financial opportunity above all else. Okay, this is pretty much what um, the chapter was all about. I'll give you perhaps 5 minutes for questions. Um, let's talk about, let's wrap up the whole thing, whether we're talking about Wuthering Heights or the Sign of Four. We have spotted some affinities and we have also spotted differences. So you guys have 5 minutes to perhaps reflect on what you have seen and read, and we can engage in discussions for another 5 minutes. I'll give you 2 minutes to think, um, perhaps think about important issues and ideas in the sign of four, and then we can always set them against Wuthering Heights and see how different or how similar they are. Okay, you guys have 3 minutes to think and reflect. Okay, so if you're ready with insights, I'm all ears. Hello. Remind me of the question of the TMA question. Remind me of the prompt. What is it that the what is required? Okay, let's first of all read what Kamar has to say, and then go back to the question that I asked. So Kamar is saying the expansion of the British Empire and the rise in immigration sharply affected how the Victorians thought of home in the 19th century. Through examining the three literary works we have studied, this is the question. I thought these are insights by Kamar. Obviously, she is copying the question. Okay, so I'm going to read it out loud. The expansion of the British Empire and the rise in immigration sharply affected how the Victorians thought of home in the 19th century. Through examining the three literary works we have studied, Bronte's Wuthering Heights, Doyle's The Sign of Four, and Stevenson The Beach of Felice, discuss how home in both the domestic and national sense is not represented in a fixed way, challenging middle class notions of social propriety. Okay, you don't have you don't have to have read The Beach of Felice in order to answer a question like this. So the question is abstract and general in its formulation and in its theory part. Okay, and then the examples are from Wuthering Heights and the other two novels. Okay, so The Beach of Felice would be more examples, but by now you can talk about the theory part of the question, and you can also apply the theoretical tenets that you have understood to the two novels. So if we're going to unpack the question, if we're going to answer it, so in brief terms and in points, what are you going to say? Yes. So if we're going to unpack the question is saying that the expansion of the British Empire. Okay, so the expansion of the British Empire would bring in the idea of abroad, right? And the rise in immigration, this is also abroad, would sharply affect how the Victorian thought of home. And then you have the idea of home. So the idea of home is in sharp contrast with the idea of abroad as given by the expansion of the British Empire and the rise in immigration. Okay? And then you're going to examine the three literary works, um, and discuss how is this happening, how is this clash is materializing in the three different novels. Okay, and in the process, you're going to talk about the tenets of both concepts, home and abroad, and how they are not represented in a normal or a traditional way. Like somebody was giving me the example of Baker and the address on Baker Street, and how even whatever is perceived as a source of comfort and security and safety is not. We even within this house and within this residence we have an alteration uh, and a disfiguring of a tarnishing of the idea of home, because the resident who happens to be eventually the bringer of security and safety and stability, Mr. Holmes is addicted himself to something. He has to inject himself a number of times a day. Remember, this is only one example of the confusion between home and abroad. This is also another example of perhaps what looks like a challenge of traditional concepts. Yeah, yeah. Okay. What's the fourth work? We have we have three works before we move on to 20th century literature as represented by James Joyce. So it's only three works that we're talking about. The focus would not be about giving what is home and what is abroad. The focus would be on whether the idea of home is presented as we understand it, or there is a challenge or a reversal of the idea, and how far abroad becomes home or gets entangled with home. How far you can see abroad at home. Okay, and when you look at the idea of abroad, like I said, it's about places and it is also about behaviors. Okay, an abnormal behavior is abroad because normal behavior is home. Remember when we spoke about the canny and the uncanny? Whatever is familiar is home. Whatever is unfamiliar is abroad. When you talk about Holmes and what he does and the injections that he gave himself, this is obviously abroad. In or at home. He's doing it at home. But the behavior is abroad, is unfamiliar. Okay, are you getting the idea? So keep an open mind. Don't be too literal in dealing with TMAs. expand your horizons. Read very in a smart way. Don't just read what comes or what meets the eye, like they say. Go deeper. There is always a surface meaning and a deep meaning. Focus on the subtleties of the question, if you like. Okay, I'll stop on this note and with this item, and I'll see you next week with the beach of Felicia, inshallah. Until then, if you have any questions, you may approach me on the group. Okay, all clear, everyone, before I leave? Okay, so I'll see you next week, inshallah.